Welcome to Bible history again. We're moving along. We're almost to the end of the year. This is lesson 6 of term 4. Let's just review just a moment. The first return of the captivity to the land of promise was led by Sheshbazzar or Zerubbabel. Number 2, the second return was led by Ezra. Number 3, the third return was led by Nehemiah. Artaxerxes was the king, and he appointed a cavalry corps to accompany Nehemiah and his group to protect them on the long journey. So there must have been a large number, though we don't know how many went. The scriptures do not mention that. Nehemiah's purpose in going back was to rebuild the city walls. The first return was to rebuild the temple. The second return was to restore worship in the temple. And now Nehemiah will return to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. Even though these returned exiles have been there about 90 years before Nehemiah came, almost a century, they still haven't done anything about these walls that are in such terrible repair. You know, people are all the same. When they get involved in their own affairs, rebuilding their houses and doing their work, it's hard to get them motivated to do the Lord's work. I've found it true. People love the Lord. Maybe it's our fault sometimes as the leaders. We don't get people motivated enough, but people are busy, and it's not easy to motivate people on a consistent long-term basis. You have spurts of activity for special projects and spurts of revival, but on a long-term basis, it's difficult to get people to consistently work and be involved in the Lord's work. So nothing was different at that time. They'd been there nearly 100 years. And they still hadn't rebuilt the walls that were in great disrepair. And no one was taking it upon himself to do it. It's a scenario that we see posed in the Proverbs. One person says, well, there's a lion in the street. Why doesn't somebody do something about it? But he leaves it to someone else. And by the grace of God, he could have been that someone that would do something about it. Once, when I was passing, I left a water hose in a loose roll in front of the hall door where we have Sunday school in Croydon Park. I thought I'd see how long it would be left there before someone would just move it aside or put it where it belonged. Friday night came. All the people came in for the activities in the hall. No one moved it. Nothing happened. I just left it. Sunday morning came, and everybody just managed to step over it and not fall, but the hose never moved. I gave up on it, and I just put the hose up myself. And I thought to myself, I've got a bunch of phlegmatics around here who'll just leave it for the next person to move it. Oh, some of them may have thought it was sacred, it shouldn't be moved. The pastor put it there, who knows? But people are the same. It's difficult to get them motivated on a consistent basis. And there are those few that see something that needs to be done, and they just do it. But there are a long distance between those few types of people. Well, before Nehemiah's return, apparently an attempt had been made to repair the city wall. But seemingly the Samaritans objected to it and opposed it, and the work was stopped. Hanani, Nehemiah's brother, had come from Jerusalem telling him of the terrible state of affairs back in Jerusalem, so especially regarding the walls. And Nehemiah was in a good position in the Persian government, in the palace. He had a lot of influence, and this is shown by the fact that when he returned to Jerusalem, the king made him the governor of Jerusalem while he was there. Well, Nehemiah chapter 1 is taken up with his grief and his emotional trauma that he felt for the spiritual deprivation and the situation in Jerusalem. He's very burdened. He's very intense about this matter. And he prays with a real heart and with tears. And then he waited some 4 months before he went to the king with this matter to make a request. But in the spring of 444 BC, he gets the opportunity from the Lord and approaches the king. Nehemiah was spiritually wise, and he didn't just push immediately into something until the Lord showed him the proper timing. The king realized that Nehemiah was distraught. He was upset about something. And he asked him, "What's bothering you, Nehemiah?" And this was Nehemiah's opportunity from the Lord. It's always best to wait on the Lord for the right timing rather than just impulsively rushing into every good project that flashes across our minds. Peter is the impulsive apostle in the New Testament, but Nehemiah waits on the Lord for the opportune time. That's always best. It was well worth waiting on, and it assured success for the big project that Nehemiah wanted to involve himself in. Wait on the Lord. Pray and ask Him to arrange circumstances instead of just rushing into something in the power of the flesh, and often it ends in failure, doesn't it? Too many of our decisions are made off the top of our heads. When we wait on the Lord, though, and He sets things in the proper order, we have His guarantee for success. So Nehemiah has it. He even gets financial aid for the project of rebuilding the walls. He goes, and then, first of all, once he arrives, he scouts around and sees the situation for himself. He does it at night, so he won't arouse any suspicion from potential enemies. He didn't stand out in the street and announce with a loudspeaker, "I'm coming here, blah, 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 and I'm going to do this, blah, blah, blah." Give away his battle plan and his secrets. No, he was wise. Sometimes we pastors do too much blabbing and too much talking about what we're going to do and blah, blah, blah. We don't know sometimes whether we're coming or going, actually. We get people confused, and we end up in a fix ourselves because we don't know how to keep our mouth shut. He quietly sees the need so that preparation can be made and a plan of action can be devised. He doesn't just want to do a lot of talking. He wants a plan that will get the job done. So he does. Then he begins to plan. He talks with some of the key people there. He gets input from them. He wants them to help him devise a plan for action. He's trying to sell them on the plan of action, which is most important. You know, many times we fail as pastors in things we attempt to do because we just don't lay the proper groundwork. Nehemiah has a great important idea, but first he must sell this idea to others, to some key individuals. And he will get input from them, and at the same time, he sells them on the plan of action. For example, as a pastor, there's a step, perhaps I feel, we need to take as a church. The Lord has burdened me for this step, and I've had answers from heaven, and I've heard bells ringing, and I just know that God wants this. So I will first talk to some key people who have wisdom and have a burden for the Lord's work, maybe one-on-one. I'll just put the idea to them, just run it by them, and just ask them for personal input and advice. And some of the advice they give will be excellent, and I'll commend that. Other parts of the advice may not be, and I will point out why this wouldn't be good. Sort of just a give and take kind of discussion, sharing with each other. And most of the time, their ideas make me aware of things that perhaps I never thought of before. And after sharing with several key people, hashing and rehashing the different ideas and the approaches, all the time showing them the need for a plan. I can then put it all together and devise a more workable plan. And at this point, these key people understand the plan and they become convinced of it. And so that means they'll be supportive of it down the track. Then after this process, I can put it to the church business meeting at large. If I didn't have key people who know something about the plan, a few people, maybe even one, can express a real negative response in the meeting, and the group mentality just take over with one negative remark building on the last one, and you find yourself on the defensive, and maybe the plan just goes down in defeat. And you as a pastor can bemoan the fact that everyone is against me and rejecting my God-given authority as a pastor, and they're rejecting my leadership. Well, we need to dispose of this mentality about our leadership, that we just get some divine revelation from the ethereal blue in the midnight hours, and then we come and just throw the bomb at the people and hoping that they get the same inspiration that we got. They probably won't get it. And then we complain because they're against us. They're despising our God-given authority. Oh boy. But when you have key people who understand your plan, they're convinced of it, then the whole picture changes in the business meeting. They'll begin to express their approval and their understanding of what needs to be done. And you won't be on the defensive all alone trying to avoid the bullets from everyone that doesn't understand the need or the logic of the plan. You need to remember the pastor has thought this thing through long and hard. He's stayed awake at night. He's been thinking and praying about it, and he's come to the conviction that we got to do this. But the people in the meeting, they haven't been through this process. They probably have never heard of this thing before right now. So don't be surprised at some negative responses. A friend of mine secretly admired a lady who was a tremendous Christian young lady. She was a very gifted singer. And he proposed to her just out of the blue. And he told her that he'd prayed. And he said, "The Lord told me and showed me that I'm to marry you." And she told him, she said, "Well, the Lord hasn't told me anything, Buster, about it. It's the first I've heard about it." Now, later on, she did pray and think, and she got to know him a bit, and she ended up marrying that fella. He was just blessed because he'd thought about it, but she hadn't. And many times we're ready, we've thought, we've studied, we've prayed, and we're convinced and passionate about this thing, and we must take action as a church, but the people aren't ready. We've got to prepare them. We've got to give them some time. We've got to do our homework and lay the ground around key people and get some consensus here. We need to respect all the viewpoints expressed and try to glean from them the beneficial and forge from them a consensus before throwing it out to the group. When you do that, you get all kinds of negative responses, and that can lead the group to the opposite conclusion of what they really ought to be doing. So a lot of good plans go down in smoke simply because we haven't done our homework with key people and gone through the procedures. While Nehemiah is getting some key people on side, and he's refining the plan of action with their suggestions, Nehemiah is smart enough to gather intelligence and forge a consensus among influential people. Well, he does his homework. He devises a plan. He gets everyone behind him. This doesn't mean he won't have opposition. He will. But hopefully he'll have it from the outside and not from the inside. It's hard to have it from the inside. Now, the opposition was from the Samaritans for the most part, with Brother Sanballat. His daughter had married probably Eliashib's grandson. Eliashib was the high priest of Jerusalem, and then there was Tobiah, this fellow that was the Ammonite who was helping him as well. And these people are going to oppose, and if you move for God, you will cause friction. On the other hand, if you haven't prepared and done your homework, then don't give in to the temptation to moan and say, oh, well, they're just, I'm trying to do something, but everybody's against me, and the devil's crowd is trying to stop me. Even after preparation, homework, and waiting on God, we'll still have opposition, and we'll just have to wade through it. Nehemiah has opposition lined up from the Samaritans, the Arabians, the Ammonites, and what have you. And they'll give him a hard time, but he'll go through. He's got the plan. Now he divides the people up into different teams. One to wield the trowel, and others to bear arms. And others will just have a trowel in one hand and a sword in the other, and be able to grab it when they need it. He took security measures, and he kept the work going and refused to let the opposition keep them from working. Sometimes we get so involved in fighting the devil that we don't have any time to build. We spend all our time and energy fighting moral issues, which is a most noble exercise, attending demonstrations and fighting the devil, but we must not stop building the wall. We're here to win people and build them into New Testament churches. That's our divine commission. We must not let any good issue derail us from our main purpose. I knew a good preacher, a man of God who had much influence, and he spent most of his life just fighting moral issues. He'd walk in demonstrations against abortion, against communism and all these moral issues, fighting the evils of society and wicked politics and so forth. But that's the way he spent his life. It's good to fight. Don't be afraid of a fight. But remember, our main job is to disciple nations, to get people saved, and to establish them in New Testament churches. And many times the devil tries to get us off the main track on something that's good, but it's not best. It's not the main job that we've been given to do here. Well, while we're doing that, we'll fight the devil. We'll stand against moral evils, and we'll give our voice in protest, but we will remember what our main purpose is. Now, the opposition tried to get Nehemiah to stop or to leave the work, but Nehemiah said it's not on. He would not negotiate with them on building a wall. And you know, there are those who want to negotiate today. We want Christianity to be one. Let's sit down and negotiate these ecumenical issues and get together. Well, we're not concerned with all this oneness that they talk about. You can have a cat and a dog in one cage, and they'll be in one cage, but they won't be one in spirit. They'll be fighting all the time. And you can get diverse peoples together in one organization, but that doesn't mean you have unity. One believes in salvation through baptism, one believes in salvation through works, and one believes it's by grace. That's a strange kind of unity, and I don't think he'll do much. Well, note Nehemiah as governor. After numerous attempts to discredit Nehemiah by approaching even his own people as well as a false prophet, they tried to divert his efforts to secondary issues and thereby stop his work. They tried to get him to sit down in an ecumenical council to talk about things that should not be on the table for discussion. We have nothing to negotiate with people who don't believe the Word of God. there's nothing to talk about. Ecumenical dialogues are not our forte. That's not our job. It is a waste of time, believe me. It has been popular in some quarters to have ecumenical dialogues. The Catholics will invite the Baptists to come and to present their views, their doctrine, so we can better understand them. And then the Baptists invite the Catholics back over to their church to come and explain their doctrines, and we just foster an ecumenical dialogue and a get-together and understanding each other, a negotiating spirit. Well, we don't have the authority to negotiate any doctrinal issue that the Bible teaches. I won't take part in such kinds of meetings. Many times those people just want to use you for their own ends. Once I made a visit to a home, and this home had 4 young men in it. They were sons of the parents there. And they were in a Catholic school and in a Catholic society, probably for Mary, and it seemed to be charismatic as well. They talked about the new birth, about the role of the Scriptures, and my first impression was, boy, these fellows are saved. They know the Lord. And as we proceeded in the discussion, I found them very fanatic about Catholic doctrine, transubstantiation, the Mass in which the bread is transformed into the body and the cup is transformed into the blood of Christ. They believed that salvation was only in the Catholic Church. They believed all the Catholic doctrines. They promoted them with fanatical zeal. And they were greatly increased in their devotion and worship to Mary and the intercession of the saints and all the basic doctrines of the Roman Catholic Church. And at the same time, talking about the new birth, their love of the Scriptures, and it was confusing and absolutely satanic. You know, Satan has dealt a master stroke. He has brought our terminology from the Scriptures and mixed it with a perverse anti-biblical system of doctrines. These people think they're the greatest thing that has hit planet Earth. And I had a hard time getting a word in edgewise with those fellas. All 4 were just bang, 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 bang. They were brainwashed. They were promoting this with a zeal, and they have corrupted the gospel, and we should not be under any delusion about what they're doing. And sadly, Billy Graham and his ecumenical evangelism and his ecumenical evangelists have contributed greatly to this situation. They have broken down a wall that needs to be standing, separating between Bible Christianity and false doctrine, and he's broken that down. He's mixed the two. And false Christianity has greatly benefited from all this reinvigorating their false system of doctrine with a new evangelical zeal and terminology to further blind men's eyes to the truth. And we've just been foolish to go along with such efforts and endeavors and just give our influence to such movements, naively thinking that we could reach them for Christ. It is most dangerous. It is satanic. Don't be a fool. Don't be a part of it. Now, Nehemiah gives us some wonderful lessons about such satanic attempts to the boundaries of Judah. The southern boundary now seems to run east and west, just to the north of Hebron, instead of at Beersheba, like it would have been previously before the exile. The remission of the debts of poor people. The situation of Judah was difficult. High Persian taxes had been levied upon them, so some of the rich people took advantage of this situation to exact an exorbitant interest on debt, so to the point of even dispossessing these poor people of their lands. Well, Nehemiah deals with that wicked practice. He then organized the spiritual matters, the reading of the law to the people and teaching them. Then they had a dedication service for the finished city walls, an exciting event that involved a procession of people around the city walls singing. What a sight it must have been. Well, Nehemiah spent 12 years as governor of Jerusalem. Then he returned to Susa, the Persian capital, for a year or two. Then he returned on a second trip to Jerusalem. And during this short time of his absence, there was a shocking neglect and laxity that had developed concerning the former problems. The problems that he'd addressed during the first visit. And when strong leadership, is gone, it doesn't take long for laxity and declension to set in and to fall back into the ditch of the old ways. The spineless Eliashib, the high priest, had given the room that is the storage room for the tithes and the offerings of the temple to the apostate Tobiah, the Ammonite, an enemy of the whole project of Nehemiah. Spineless compromiser ought to have his head cut off. And Nehemiah kicked him out for the glory of God and restored the room to its original purpose. Well, laxity in the tithes and the Sabbath were again addressed. Nehemiah wanted God's blessings. He wanted the people to obey the Lord and follow Him, and he wielded a strong hand in restoring the truth to its rightful position. He had to deal with the mixed marriage problem again. The people just couldn't keep it right. Some children couldn't speak Hebrew. Everybody's mixed up and confused because of the intermarriage of God's people with the pagans. And it seems just hopeless, and it would be easy to just give up and consign the whole thing and go back to Susa and say, this is it, I've had it. But Nehemiah didn't do that. This reminds me of something. We spend time with people, we try to help them, and they just go on in the wrong ways. You just feel like throwing them over the moon and being through with them and not wasting any more time. But you can't give up. You're doing all of this as unto the Lord, and so we can't just leave the people to their own self-devised end. One fellow said, "Oh, I love the ministry so much." But he said, "I hate people." Well, that's a bit of a contradiction, isn't it? Because the ministry does involve people. I know what he meant. But we can't do that. Nehemiah didn't give up. He just continues on. He found out that one of Eliashib's grandsons had married a daughter of Sanballat, an enemy of God, and he expelled them from Judah. God bless him. And Nehemiah was a courageous man for God who wasn't afraid to do the right thing. Now let's pick up the remainder of this subject of Nehemiah. Well, it was completed in 7 weeks. That was a fast job. They really got to work, and a lot of people did a lot of work in a short time. Number 1, opposition from without. And number 2, hindrances from within. So there was opposition, there were hindrances, but God gave the victory. There's a poem for builders. We are builders of a city in the minds and lives of men, and we work with love and pity, using voice and deed and pen. It shall certainly be finished, though as yet we know not when, this fair city of true worship to the one true God again. Though Sanballats and Tobiahs in their thousands may oppose, God still has His Nehemiahs, who at last repulse all foes. Oft resisted, ne'er defeated, with our trials on we plod, till that city is completed by the reigning Christ of God. Well, that's nice. Characteristics of Nehemiah. Number one, he was clear-seeing. He could see the issue. He could define what needed to be done. Number two, he was plain-speaking. Didn't beat around the bush. Came to the point. Plain-speaking. Number three, he was firm-dealing. He had a firm hand and the courage to do what was right. William Law describes the fervency of Nehemiah's spirit, and I'd like for you to hear this. It is not the arithmetic of our prayers, how many they are, nor the rhetoric of our prayers, how eloquent they are, nor the geometry of our prayers, how long they are, nor the music of our prayers, how sweet our voice may be, nor the logic of our prayers, how argumentative they may be, nor the method of our prayers, how orderly they may be, which God cares for. Fervency of spirit is that which availeth much. Truly, this is the important thing about Nehemiah. So fervent, so concerned, so 100% out and out for God, and that's what made Nehemiah the man that he was. Now, the chronology in this return is most important, and if you get the framework right for these events, you can keep the events in proper timing and perspective. Let's look at a brief chronology of the post-exilic people and the events. So, number one, 538 BC. At the decree of Cyrus, Zerubbabel takes 50,000 back to Judea. Number two, 536 BC. The foundation of the new temple was laid, but the rebuilding was held back till a later time. Number three, 520 BC, the ministry of the prophets Haggai and Zechariah commence, and the rebuilding of the temple is resumed. Number four, 515 BC, the restoration of the temple completed. Over 20 years after the return that this happened. Number five, the events of Esther and the preservation of the exilic Jews. Number six, 458, the return of some 2,000 under Ezra. Number seven, 444 BC, Nehemiah comes to Jerusalem by a royal edict as the governor to rebuild the city walls. Number 8, 430 BC, Nehemiah returns to Jerusalem after an absence on a visit to Artaxerxes. Malachi prophesies sometime after this. Well, that will help you on keeping the chronology of these events in their proper timing. Now let's talk about the book of Esther. Many of the Jews outside of Judah did not return to their homeland. They're scattered over the lands of Assyria and Babylon and Persia, and some are in Egypt, as we've noted. They're quite prosperous. They have complete freedom of movement and employment. But when the door opened for them to return to their homeland in Judah, they did not return. And the book of Esther has to do with the life of some of those people and gives some good insight as to what was going on with these Jews in these different lands. The name King Ahasuerus is merely the Hebrew equivalent, the translation for Xerxes. So Ahasuerus and Xerxes are the same person. He's the Persian king, you know, that Esther married. You know the story of Esther. Vashti, Xerxes' wife, didn't want to welcome his guest, and so he gave her the royal sack. And then he began looking for a new wife. And there was a little Jewish orphan girl who had been taken captive, named Esther. And she had an influential uncle named Mordecai. And she becomes queen, becomes the wife of Xerxes. It's hard to believe. A poor Jewish orphan girl becomes the wife of the ruler of the world's greatest empire. My, what a story. Then the proud, arrogant Haman, who hates Mordecai, and wants to kill him, gets the king's blessing to not only kill Mordecai, but to kill all the Jews in the kingdom. So Mordecai brings the sad news to Esther and says, "Who knows but that God has brought you to the kingdom for such a time as this?" So Esther rises to the occasion, and at the risk of her own life, she comes to the king and requests from the king her husband. And God, in his mighty providential care, comes and delivers not only Mordecai from death, but all the Jews from death. A lovely story in this historical book, which gives us a most interesting picture of the Jews and their life at this time outside the land of promise. Now note several significant facts of this book. Number one, the amazing freedom to live and work in these lands. Certainly they were not oppressed once they were there. Number two, the large numbers of Jews. It would take 75,000 executioners to kill the Jews, which means there was a large number of them. Number three, it also shows us that the Jews had enemies as they do today. Haman was obsessed with his hatred of them, which led him to this ingenious plan to destroy them. Number four, God's providential, special care is exercised for his people. Though they had not been obedient to the Lord to return and rebuild their land and worship, they had stayed here where they were financially and materially blessed. Yet God still cared for them and loved them. He gave insomnia to the king at just the right time, and the king called for the records to be read to him, and then he found out what Mordecai had done. He remembered this. So when Haman comes to present his diabolical plot to the king for a great reward to be given to a worthy person thinking of himself, then God has reminded the king of good Mordecai and what he's done. And so the king says, "Oh, Mordecai, he's the person, the worthy person for whom this ought to be done." And so Haman has to lead Mordecai's horse around the city, paying homage to Mordecai, and it just about killed him, dried up his gizzard to do that. But God just intervened for his people. Well, all of this is not coincidental. God is intervening to deliver his people in little ways, little things, all make us to see and to know God's great care of us. Number five, the Feast of Purim. It grew out of God's deliverance from Haman's diabolical plan to destroy them as a people. Haman drew lots to determine the day for the execution of his plan. So the Jews called this feast of celebration for God's deliverance Purim, which simply means lot. Let's just jump over to the subject of Esther there so we can just complete our discussion about this book. Number one, the purpose of the book is to demonstrate the providential care of God over his people. Number two, God's name is not mentioned one time in this book. The silence was intentional to show God's displeasure, yet he is merciful, preserving them. They typically portrayed, of course, the history of the Jewish race as a whole when they would reject Christ and be scattered among the nations. And then number three, God's name does, however, appear indirectly in Esther through a hidden acrostic. We've studied about acrostics. It appears 5 times in a hidden acrostic. The acrostic consonants representing the name of God were written larger to make them stand out. 4 times we have JHVH, in other words, Jehovah. They appear 4 times. And Ahya, AHYH, a form of Jehovah, appears once. That's quite interesting. Now note the types in Esther. Number 1, wicked Haman prefigures the man of sin, the Antichrist. Number 2, Esther prefigures a type of the institution of the church. Number 3, Mordecai would represent the faithful Jewish remnant, which will be preserved through great tribulation to enter into the millennial kingdom. That's still to come in the future, of course. So beautiful types there. Now, note the subject of the Elephantine colony. Elephantine is a small island right in the middle of the Nile River in the south part of Egypt at the First Cataract, which is about 800 kilometers south of the Mediterranean outlet of the Nile River. Now, here's a little island from the west side of the Nile. And then here you can see it from the other side, the east side of the Nile. Note the Nilometers, which were placed in these old constructions to measure the rise of the annual flooding of the Nile. This picture shows Nilometers with Roman letters and also with Arabic letters. A lot of history here. There are extensive excavations on this little island, and our interest in its history has to do with the life of the Jews who lived outside of Palestine. There are numerous papyri written in Aramaic that were found in these excavations in 1903 for the most part. And these papyri date back to the 5th century before Christ. This group of Jews may have descended from those Jews that took Jeremiah with them by force when they fled Judah in fear of Babylon. Now, this colony served as a southern military garrison for the Persians who were stationed in Egypt. Now, the contents of this papyri vary considerably in character. Number one, a copy of a famous inscription by Darius II in Persian. Number two, there was a marriage document. Number three, there was another document dated 419 BC instructing the Elephantine Jews by the authority of the Persian government to keep their own Passover feast in accordance with the practice of the temple in Jerusalem. That's quite interesting. Number four, these papyri show that these Jews had a temple to Jehovah in the Elephantine colony. This means that though they were far from Jerusalem, they had not forgotten the one true God. And other important events in connection with that temple in 410 BC, the temple of Jehovah at Elephantine was destroyed, and this prompted a letter to be sent by these Jews to the high priest in Jerusalem asking for material help to rebuild that temple. They didn't get any answer, and so there were other letters recorded there. And finally, the satrap, that is, a governor of one of the provinces, Arsames, apparently gave assistance for the temple to be rebuilt, and that happened in 402 BC. Now, number five, the papyri demonstrate that regular communication existed between this Egyptian group of Jews and the Jews in Judah. And number six, the papyri also showed that this group expected and at times received financial aid from the motherland. And number seven, the papyri also mentioned several names of the time that appear in the Bible in its record. And one such person was Sanballat. So these papyri mention him and mention some others that are also mentioned in the Bible. So it's just an interesting confirmation of what was going on with the Jews during that time. Now let's just say just a quick word about Malachi. He was the last Old Testament prophet who ministered during Nehemiah's time. And the key thought of Malachi is, behold, he shall come. Now, number one, the people had wrong attitudes to divine promises. Number two, they had fallen into unblushing hypocrisy in their dealings both with God and with each other, and Malachi attacks them for this. Number three, Malachi hit out at the lack of godliness, especially of the priests. And number four, he attacked the foreign marriages that were against the Word of God and had destroyed purity among the people of God. And number five, he rebuked the laxity in paying the tithe and the offerings and supporting the temple ministry. Malachi, of course, is the last book of the Old Testament. And that's the atmosphere which we get of the Jews of his day as he checks it out. Now let's talk about the book of Job. There's some doubt where exactly this book fits in historically. The truth is, probably this is the oldest book in the Bible and perhaps in the world. Some put it back around the time of Abraham. It obviously was written before the law of Moses, so it's a very old book. So our study of this book fits better now than it would have fit at the beginning, because we just weren't quite ready for it at the beginning. We needed all this background, and then we'll end up with the book of Job. It is written in poetic form, and it would rate as one of the world's greatest literary masterpieces. Number one, the subject of Job is the mystery of the suffering of the godly. So it is a very relevant book to us. Number two, the special purpose of the book is to show that there is a benevolent, divine purpose running through the sufferings of the godly, and that life's bitterest enigmas and paradoxes are reconcilable with this benevolent, divine purpose, did we but know all the facts. In other words, there are questions, there are paradoxes, but there is a divine purpose running through all of those that culminate in a good end for us. The problem now is that we don't know all the facts, and that's the story of the book of Job. Now, why was not Job told these reasons? Number one, if he had known, there would have been no place for faith, and he could not have come out purified as gold in the fire. We are meant to understand that there are some things which God cannot reveal to us at the present time, inasmuch as the very revealing of those things would thwart and would stop His purpose for our good. Now, number two, and I like this, the Scriptures are as wise in their reservations as they are in their revelations. You know, God doesn't tell us some things because we don't need to be told. So God deserves that right, so that our faith can be strengthened, so that we can come into a richer life in faith, and that not knowing is what develops us into the people He wants us to be. Did we know all the reasons for this, we would not be developed in faith, and we would not grow. God's purpose would not be fulfilled in our lives. It's something to suffer if you really understood all the reasons and what would come out of it. But it's quite something else to suffer when you don't understand the reason for it. You can't see any earthly reason. You can't see any earthly good to come out of it. But by faith, you can just trust it to God and wait on Him. That's another kind of faith. Number three, enough is revealed to make faith intelligent. Enough is reserved to give faith scope for development. So God tells us enough, just enough, but He leaves enough untold so that we'll develop and grow. Number four, the final conclusion and lesson from Job is this: there is blessing through suffering. Did you hear that? Hear it again. There is blessing through suffering. If you learn anything out of Job, just learn that. Most of the book of Job is one questionnaire after another questionnaire, and everybody is philosophizing about why it is happening and why it shouldn't have happened and what's gone wrong. And Job finally gets put out with his friends, his wife, just told him, well, just curse God and check it out, brother. We've all had enough. Just tell God you can't take any more and just curse God and die. His friends supposedly were there with him, consoling him. And with friends like this, you don't need any enemies. They were saying, Job, you're just a big hypocrite. You're just being chastised for your rotten sin, and you need to get on your knees and confess your sin right here and quit acting pious. Job said, no way, I am not. And it just went back and forth, and no one really knows what is going on. But at the end of the book, we can see blessing through suffering. Number 5, the New Testament counterpart of this truth is found in Romans 8:28, where we know that all things work together for good to them who love God, who are the called according to His purpose. William Cowper wrote, and I want you to hear this, behind a frowning providence, God hides a smiling face. I love that. When it seems that God is frowning, as if He is not happy, as if care is languishing, God hides a smiling face. Well, Edersheim wrote something about this, and I found it very good, so would you please listen to what he has to say? We cannot understand the meaning of many trials. God does not explain them. To explain a trial would be to destroy its object, which is that of calling forth simple faith and implicit obedience. If we knew why the Lord sent us a trial, it would thereby cease to be a trial, either of faith or of patience. Oh, that's beautiful. Well, let's note Job's wonderful friends, their philosophies and their religious titles. Eliphaz, he was a fellow who argued on the basis of experience. Number 2, Bildad, he argued on the basis of traditions and what we know of what's gone on before. And then number 3, Zophar, he argued on the basis of assumption. He assumed certain things. These fellows ought to be given a doctor's degrees. And I know plenty of places who'd give them doctor's degrees. They're eloquent, they're philosophical, they got these great sermons and great speeches that really sound good, but they miss the point. You say, well, what about the inspiration of this book? We say the Bible is inspired of God. What about Job? Is it inspired of God? Is everything these people say inspired? Is it right? Well, yes, it's inspired. And that means they said exactly what the Bible says they said, even if it were wrong. Inspiration simply sets down exactly what they said, the way they said it, whether what they said is right or whether it's wrong. That is, not all is inspired truth, which we are to believe and live by. It does not mean that God endorses what they're saying or what wicked or even backslidden men say. It just means that whatever God says they said, they did say it like that. And when God says that the devil told a lie, you can count on it, the devil told a lie. But that doesn't mean we're to believe the devil's lie and follow it and live by it. To know if what they said is truth, inspired truth, and should be followed, then we have to take all the scriptures into account and see what does the scripture really teach us, what is the divine teaching about this subject. And that is basically the book of Job in a very small nutshell. This is a tremendous book. Oh, we could spend so much time on it. It's a book that's been a blessing to generations and multiplied millions of people. And you can talk with any person out in the world and he talks about the patience of Job. This book has had a tremendous influence, and for the Christian, it gives us hope. Job, who didn't have the Bible as we have it, he had no record in his hands, apparently, and yet he had a faith in God, And God brought him to a beautiful, beautiful conclusion in his life. After all of his suffering and his tragedy, the end of Job was blessed much more than the beginning. There is blessing in suffering, people, and just remember that when you suffer, when you go through trials, God is going to use it for your eternal good. He's going to make it as a great blessing to many other people. And just thank God that you've been counted worthy to suffer for the Lord and for His kingdom. Well, that's the end of our lesson today. Next week will be our last lecture. I hope you've got everything in line and everything just up to par on schedule, so that in 2 weeks' time we'll have our final test. God bless you, and that's it for today.